for? Please teach us, Rabbi Meir.
Okay, Talmud, Rosh Hashiva, here I go. Okay, so the next melacha is called Potseah. Potseah, Pei, Vav, Tzadi, Ayin, which means untwisting threads. And two prohibitions here: separating interwoven or twined threads, especially for reweaving. And the second one is undoing braids or meshwork. Okay, that's only the thing about that. Then the next one is tying or untying, kosher or matir. Okay, two prohibitions: tying knots or untying knots. These prohibitions do not apply to the knots which are both temporary and unprofessional in nature. A bow knot, such as the type used on a shoelace or a necktie knot, may be tied and untied. However, these knots may be tied only if it is intended they will be temporary, that is, undone within 24 hours. A single knot may be used to tie a key to a piece of string. Since it can easily become undone, it is not considered secure enough to be called a knot. One may not, however, tie a single knot on its own, like those often made at the ends of tzitzit threads to prevent the twine from fraying or unraveling. Double knots may not be tied or untied. If a single knot was made before Shabbos, it may not be formed into a double knot on Shabbos. And lastly, when food is tied up with string, such as with figs, one may not untie it, but one may cut the string. However, if the bow knot of a shoelace falls into an ordinary knot, it may be undone. That's what we were actually discussing yesterday. So, just going back to the one point, the double knots may not be tied or untied. If a single knot was made before Shabbos, it may be formed into a double knot. It may not be formed into a double knot. Okay, that would actually would be applicable to us in terms of shoelaces.
All right, so listen, I just wanted to let you know where we left off yesterday, just to read it mufurish, just to make it a little bit clearer. It was pretty straightforward, but I think a 1-minute review makes sense. So basically, Rav Papa, there was an explanation, right? So the thing of it is, Rabba was saying that this case where the husband doesn't inherit from his wife is in a case where the woman was divorced, and Rav Nachman says the same thing, okay? And then what we discussed is that, look, as far as the rights of the offspring are concerned with the miscarriage, there, even if it's not really the husband or they're divorced, he still gets the payment because he fathered the offspring. It uses the word Baal, okay, in the Chumash. And if you look at it, it's under Shemot chapter 21, verse 22. So that's your reference. And then the Gemara says, listen, there's another way to explain this, because Rabba and Rav Nachman interpret the Bryce as referring to a divorced woman. Now, before I explain, I'll give you a quick summary as to why, which I explained to you the rules yesterday. It's basically the reason why Rabba and Rav Nachman have to interpret this is because they're going according to the opinion of Rebbe, okay? Because Rebbe says that basically a benefit which automatically accrues, like to the field of the deceased after his death, is considered an asset possessed by the deceased creditor, regardless of how the loan is eventually repaid. Okay? So according to Rebbe, the husband is entitled to the damages owed by his wife, whether they're collected in cash or real property. And how does it equate this? It says, well, look, we've then got to go to Bava Basra and see the principle, and the principle is talking about the firstborn son. So if it's not prospective assets, which means after the father's death, I mean, we're talking about the wife before, and does the husband inherit? But we're saying the principle is exactly the same. We take a look at Bava Basra. We're talking about the principle of prospective assets. So the bottom line is as follows. You have somebody that you are the beneficiary of. So in our Gemara's case, we're saying the husband is the beneficiary of the wife's assets. Okay, but in this particular case, we're saying in Bava Basra, if the children are the beneficiaries, the first son gets the double portion. He only gets a single portion if it's not really the beneficiary, but the estate does get the money back, and they do get the money back. However, it's only considered posthumously, meaning after death. She never really owned that asset in her lifetime. That's what the whole discussion is about. And then you can equate that to, does the husband get the inheritance from his wife? So obviously the one opinion, Rebbe, is saying, look, in that particular case, if the Gemara is holding like that, if they're explaining it according to Rebbe, then we need a different explanation compared to if they're explaining it according to the rabbis. So according to Rebbe, the husband is entitled to the damages owed to his wife. It doesn't matter whether they collected it in cash or real property, or whose opinion it is according to Rav Nachman or Rabbah. According to Rebbe, the only thing he's not entitled to is kofir. Because even if he's married to, that's considered a prospective asset, because she never inherited it in her lifetime. It was only assessed after her death. So even Rabbah and Rav Nachman interpret the brisa which awards the damages of a woman to the heirs to be referring to a divorcee. Okay? Because why are they explaining that? Because there's no other logical explanation. They're saying the reason the husband doesn't get the damages for paying, I'm talking about damages while she's alive, is we're not talking about, we've already cleared up as far as the offspring is concerned for the miscarriage. Even if they're divorced, he gets it because he fathered the child. But according to Pain, Tsar and Nezek, actual damages, that particular thing comes to the husband while he's alive, according to the opinion of Rebbe. According to the opinion of the rabbis, it's according to Rabbi Akiva specifically, it's not true. It's really, really not true, because it's not a case where he's considered the cohabitor. This is a case where he has to be married to her. But Rav Nachman and Rabba are saying that as far as kofir is concerned, for sure, that even if the husband is married to her, he's not entitled to it. Okay, so let's just go to the new section, because we discussed. I'll finish off with a quick summary, and then let's just go to the new section. Okay, a similar ruling regarding kofir. Just give me a sec, guys. The Gemara wonders why the brisa could not have been explained differently. Why was it necessary for Rabbah and Rav Nachman to interpret the brisa as referring to a divorced woman? Let us interpret the brisa according to Rabbah as referring to a case where after the death of the woman, the court collected payment for damages in cash. And according to Rav Nachman, to a case where they collected real property. For elsewhere we found that these Amoraim consider such payments to be prospective assets of the deceased creditor, which a husband does not inherit from his wife's estate. Obviously, why? Because he doesn't inherit prospective assets. He only inherits assets from her estate if she had them while she was alive. So Rabbi said, look, in regard to we can equate this to Bava Kamma, Bava Basra 124b, that Rabbi said in regard to the firstborn to the double portion of an outstanding loan owed to the deceased parent. Okay, so say for example, the father lends $100,000 and he's got a lien on the property for $100,000 worth of property. The creditor's heirs collect the loan from real property, and the firstborn has the right to a double portion of the land, as is the law concerning assets possessed by the deceased during his lifetime. So why is it considered his assets? Because if he's actually got since the creditor basically held a lien on this land during his lifetime, we view it as if the land was already in his possession before death. That's Rashi's explanation of Rabbah. So he's saying, listen, he had a lien. If the person defaulted on the payment, he could have taken that particular property. So it was deemed in his lifetime. So therefore, it's not a prospective asset according to Rabba, real property. And therefore, the firstborn son can get a double portion. Okay? But cash, if he's paid with the money in cash. So say, for example, we said out of $100,000, this is very quick, out of $100,000, there's only $7,000 remaining. Guy's not going to get rid of his property for a small amount. He's going to just pay the balance in cash. Now, that is considered a prospective asset according to Rabbah, because the husband never got that cash back in his lifetime. It's not like he had. How could he extract the cash, Gavin? He couldn't. He couldn't get access to Shimon's bank account, Reuven. He couldn't, unless Reuven gave him the money. Unless Shimon gave him the money. So he didn't have it in his lifetime, according to Rabbah. So the firstborn doesn't get the double portion. It's a prospective asset. Rav Nachman holds differently. He said, look, cash is considered in the person's lifetime, because Reuven had 100,000. He lent it to Shimon. So he had the money in his lifetime. Okay? So that was considered his, and Shimon owed it to him, and that was the arrangement. So in that particular case, the firstborn son is entitled to the double portion. But with regards to real property, he's not. Why? Because if the guy never defaulted on the payment, he wouldn't get that actual property. That lien was an insurance policy, basically. So he views it that the deceased didn't get anything other than a piece of paper during his lifetime. And he didn't get the property. In other words, say it was a property, as I said yesterday, in Umschlange. Could the family go on holiday with it? No. It only meant that if the payment went south, that he could attach the property, but he never got use out of it during his lifetime. All right. So that's the bottom line where we're holding. I hope that helps. So the Gemara answers the statements of the Academy said, the statements of Rav and Rav Nachman concerning the rights of the firstborn to a debt owed to the deceased apply to the view of the Westerners. Now, who are the Westerners? The Babylonians, because this is Talmud Bavli, refer to people, the great rabbis of Eretz Israel, as Westerners. So they're saying the Westerners, which were the majority of the rabbis in Eretz Israel, maintained that generally an outstanding loan is considered a prospective asset. Okay, because as seen in Bava Basra 124a, the rabbis and Rebbe argue concerning a benefit which automatically accrues to an asset after one's death. Okay, so the rabbis basically maintain that a benefit is considered a prospective asset in which the firstborn is not entitled to a double portion. So Rebbe contends that the firstborn does receive a double portion in such assets. Okay, so Rebbe is saying something different, is that even a prospective asset doesn't prevent the firstborn from getting it. Does that make sense? Have you falling asleep a little?
No, I'll focus. I heard you.
Okay, so explain it to me, the difference between rabbis and Rebbe.
No, I don't know who the different rabbis are. I can't tell you properly.
No, but Rebbe's opinion.
So I can tell you Rebbe's opinion then. So what he's saying is that is what we're talking about. I've just gone blank for a second. Just give it to
prospective asset.
Okay. So he's saying that the prospective assets don't. So one of the rabbis is saying that the prospective asset doesn't become part and parcel of the inheritance, and therefore they can't. They might actually get the money, but it's not part of the actual inheritance itself. It's a separate amount. Therefore, the firstborn son won't get a double portion. And one of the other rabbis is saying no, it's not a prospective asset because it was a loan taken out in this guy's lifetime, and therefore the son would be able to get the firstborn will be able to get a double portion.
Exactly. So Rebbe basically, exactly as Gavin says, contends that the firstborn does receive a double portion in these assets. Why? Because he compares a loan owed to the deceased to such a benefit, and accordingly presumes that the firstborn's right to a double portion of the loan is subject to the same dispute as the rabbis and Rebbe. Okay, so exactly that. The rabbis are saying a benefit that automatically accrues to an asset after one's death is something that is considered a prospective asset because the person didn't have it in their lifetime, so the firstborn can't get the double portion. So basically, there was a ruling sent east to Babylonia. So the sages of Eretz Yisrael, who are referred to as the Westerners, were asserting that the rabbis maintained that the firstborn does receive a double portion of the outstanding loans owed to his parent. Because, in other words, what it's saying is, Gavin, there seems to be a bit of broken telephone. Initially, it seemed as though the rabbis said the firstborn doesn't get the double portion. And then the rabbis from Eretz Yisrael sent a note saying that he does. So then we say, well, how do we reconcile our brisa? Well, very simple. Is that basically to reconcile this ruling that in fact it's not a prospective asset. Rav Nachman explains that although the rabbis basically consider the proceeds of a loan collected after the death of a creditor to be a prospective asset of the deceased, when payment is received in cash, the proceeds are viewed as an asset possessed by the lender during his lifetime. Okay, and Rav on the other hand explains that the sages of Eretz Yisrael refer only to a loan collected from real property. So basically, Rebbe maintains that a loan, like a benefit that automatically accrues to the field of a deceased after the death, is considered an asset possessed by the deceased creditor, regardless of how the loan is eventually paid. So Rebbe is saying, look, it doesn't matter if they weren't able to get use of the property or whatever the case may be. The truth of it is that they had some sort of collateral. So whether they were paid back in cash or had a lien on the property, Rebbe is saying different. It's saying, listen, it is considered as though the father originally had the asset because he could claim it back. He had reason to claim it back. So basically, it leaves no choice. Rabba and Rav Nachman have to interpret the brisa, which awards the damages of a woman to her heirs, to be referring to her husband, who she's divorced from. Otherwise, he'd get a share. Because does that make sense? If they're holding like Rebbe, there's no reason why the husband shouldn't get the assets. So what they're saying is that either if you hold by Rebbe, he has to be a divorcee. She has to be a divorcee. Otherwise, he'd get it. But if you're holding by the rabbis, we can hold of this term of prospective assets. Does that make sense? Guys, ask me if you have any questions before we move on to the next topic. Okay, so, all right. In a nutshell, Rav Nachman and Rabbi Kevin hold by Rebbe that saying that it's not considered a prospective asset because technically even if the person couldn't holiday with that home, they had the asset. Legally, they had the asset, okay? And if they were paid back in cash, they were entitled to the cash back because they had a lien on that asset. They'd either get the asset or they'd get the cash, but they had some sort of legal recourse. That's what Rebbe is saying. So therefore, the firstborn son could get the double portion. So the husband could get what's owing to him, because the firstborn son and the husband are both entitled to the money if it's not considered a respective asset. Does that make sense? So in that particular case,
same rule for both of them.
That's the same rule for both of them. So you have to keep you falling asleep. I saw your eyes closed. So we have to.
1 second.
Yes. So we obviously have to say, Kev, that the bottom line is that if you're holding like Rebbe, that the husband is entitled to the money, or the firstborn is entitled to the double portion, it's not seen as a prospective asset because they can still, they've still got a legal claim. Whether they paid back in cash or they eventually have to claim back the property, they've still got a legal claim. So therefore, the only reason the husband can't get it in this case is he must be divorced from his wife. That's why Rabbi and Rav Nachman explain it as it must be a divorce. But if they're holding according to the rabbis, they said, listen, it's very, very simple. It's very simple. It's certainly not going to be a problem. So because we don't know when this document was received by the rabbis from Eretz Yisrael, but either way, it's fine. Because as far as as far as rubber is concerned, okay, is that you still, if you've got a lien on the property, you've got the property within your lifetime, but cash, you've got no way to extract it from a bank account. So cash is considered a prospective asset, but not a lien on a property. The person defaults in your lifetime. If they default, you can claim back the property. You might not be able to use it, but you've certainly got with which to claim. If you don't have that, you have that anyway, but in the meantime, your cash is in the other person's bank account. You can't extract it. You can sell the property to get your money back, but the cash is not yours. So the cash, according to Rabbah, is a prospective asset. Rav Nachman said, well, you can't go holidaying, basically, with that property, and it's not yours in your lifetime. It comes in one go because the creditor has to pay up when that person dies. Or if that person defaults, you can do it, but at the moment, you're not enjoying the property. You can't live on the property. So it's considered a piece of paper. It's a guarantee, basically. That's all. And then if you pay cash, you lend the money out in cash. And if the person paid cash, well, it's your cash you're getting back anyway. It might not be the same notes. So that's the end of it. So that's how we've discussed that. All right. Good. So we're saying the Gemara cites a ruling regarding the 30 shekel payment imposed on the owner of a muad that kills a slave, a muad. Okay? Rav Shimon ben Lakesh said, the owner of an ox that killed a slave unintentionally, for which the ox is not liable to death, is absolved from 30 shekel payment normally imposed on one whose muad ox kills the slave. Do you all understand that, or must I break it up further?
I'm fine.
Kev, do you understand, or must I explain it?
So just say it again. Just so I lost track for.
All right.
Say if a slave gets killed, the muad. Okay.
Okay, so that's true. If the owner of a muad ox kills a slave, if the ox kills a slave, Rav Shimon ben Lakesh said, the owner of the ox that killed a slave unintentionally, the key word is unintentionally, for which the ox is not liable to death, is absolved from the 30 shekel payment merely imposed on whose muad ox kills a slave. So what we're saying here in a nutshell is that there's a correlation. In other words, there's a correlation between the owner's penalty of a 30 shekel fine and the ox's punishment of being stoned. So this is basically indicating that if the owner isn't punished with a 30 shekel fine unless its ox will be stoned to death. That's according to Kova Yeshua. Does that make sense, Kev? Just tell it back to me, and then we can move on.
If owner of a muad ox kills a slave unintentionally,
yeah,
then they're not. They're liable for the 30 shekel payment.
No,
we're not liable. As long as it's if it's intentional, yes. Unintentional, they're exempt.
Why?
Because this 30, I think the 30 shekel payment is a penalty for intentional damage, or it's a prescribed penalty.
Okay, Arthur, why? Do you have an answer? Kev, I know you know it. You've just done Chazor. I'm testing other guys. It's not that I'm trying.
No, I do know it. It's fine.
Why? It's very simple here, okay? Is that if you have a muad ox, and Kevin, that muad ox was going to attack another ox and kill it, and that other ox got out of the way and it killed a Jew, we treat a death of an animal owned by a Jew the same way that we treat a Jew. How do we do that? We say, look, if a Jew was meant to kill an animal, accidentally killed another Jew, would we stone him? Guys, would we stone him? Yes or no? No, of course not.
No,
it's unintentional.
Therefore, that's exactly it. Therefore, the person that the Jewish owner of the ox doesn't deserve to lose his benefit of his ox by having that ox stoned, because if we don't put a person to death, the laws always parallel. However we stone or put to death the animal of a Jew is the same way that we would put to death a Jew under the same circumstances. Therefore, any unintentional killing where a Jew was going to kill an animal and accidentally the animal got out of the way and the Jew got tonked, in that way, he goes to the city of refuge, but he doesn't get the death penalty. So we don't stone the animal because its intention was to kill another ox, and it ended up killing the slave. Okay? Now, what happens is that a slave is a human being. If a Jew kills, if you kill a human being, you're liable to the death penalty. But it's unintentional, so therefore the owner doesn't have spiritual blood on his hands to the same degree with the muad ox, okay? So there's a juxtaposition. If the animal is not put to death for something unintentional, in that case, that's correlated to the 30 shekel fine. Now, it's only considered a fine according to some opinions. But the problem is that the 30 shekel fine is not eligible for a tam ox. Why? Well, there are two reasons. Is that the fact of it is even kofir, there's that verse, the owner of the ox is absolved, naki, which says there's no, for tam, you don't pay kofir, and the kofir is for a free person. The 30 shekel fine is for the owner that's lost his slave asset. Does that make sense? The two are correlated. So the owner of the ox is absolved means just as you're not spiritually liable for a relaxed tame ox that kills, you're not liable for the 30 shekel payment for a tame ox. Does that make the two are correlating? Yep. The two are correlating. So we're saying, well, when do you owe the kofir payment for muad? In what case don't you? Is when you wouldn't stone a Jew that committed a murder. You sit into the city of refuge. The ox meant to kill another ox. It killed the slave or it killed a free person. In that particular case, we cannot put the animal to death. Therefore, there's no kofir payment. Therefore, there's no 30 shekel fine payment. That's all we're saying. So fine, if the ox unintentionally kills the slave, the owner doesn't have to pay a 30 shekel fine payment. Okay, my blood sugar's low again. Excellent. So there's a similar ruling regarding kofir. So now we've just discussed, we need to firstly give a source for Rav Shimon ben Lakish. Okay? Rav Shimon ben Lakish said the owner of an ox that killed a slave unintentionally, for which the ox is not liable to death, is absolved from 30 shekel payment, normally imposed upon one whose muad ox kills a slave. The source of this ruling, for it stated, if the ox shall gore a slave or a maidservant, 30 silver shekels shall be given to his master, and the ox shall be stoned, implying that whenever the ox is punished with stoning for killing the slave, the owner pays 30 shekels to the slave's master. But if the ox is not punished with stoning because it killed the slave unintentionally, then the owner does not pay 30 shekels to the slave's master. And what's the source of this? Shmot, Exodus chapter 21, verse 32. So now we're learning a similar rule regarding kofir. So that was the rule regarding a slave was Rav Shimon ben Lakish. The rule regarding kofir is Rabbah. Rabbah said, the owner of an ox that killed a free man unintentionally is absolved from paying the kofir. So in other words, if one's not a slave, but it's a free man or a woman, you don't have to pay the kofir payment. Why, Kevin? If it's unintentional, why?
Why don't you have to pay the kofir payment if it's unintentional?
Correct.
Because the kofir payment is a punishment for intentional. Because if it's muad, it's the kofir payments the payment for intentional damage.
Okay,
or death, should we say?
Can we explain it a little bit more simply? In other words, the owner of a muad ox has to pay kofir. I'm going to give it to you in two sentences. The owner of a muad ox has to pay kofir because this ox had a nature of goring, and he is spiritually responsible for having a dangerous animal not well looked after. And therefore, he should owe his life at the hands of heaven. and this is atonement to protect his soul because heaven holds him responsible. So it's an atonement payment, but within the atonement, it's also a compensation to the family for their financial loss. Because if the person is damaged, you pay. If the person is damaged, you pay damages. If the person is dead, you pay coffee. You don't pay both. And then we say that it's assessed mainly by halacha according to the value of the victim. So too damages are assessed according to the value of the victim. So they're both parallel. Where damages are paid for injury, kofar is paid for death. Because so it's done A, to compensate the family, but B, all the rabbis agree it's spiritual atonement for the one that should have looked after his ox better with the bad habitual nature. So that's why we pay kofar. The second sentence as to why in this case kofar was not paid is because that ox killed a free person, a free Jew, unintentionally. Why? He was trying to attack an animal, and the animal got out of the way, and the Jew was by the falafel stand, and the Jew is no longer. Therefore, in that particular case, a Jew that killed another Jew by accident, by trying to kill an animal, doesn't get the death penalty. So too, this ox doesn't get the death penalty. Because why would you render the owner of such an ox who's a Jew that financial loss? Because when the animal is stoned, you can't get financial benefit. Because it parallels the case of no payment being made for kofar in a case where there's an unintentional death. Does that make sense? Arthur, I'm looking at Arthur sealing, and I don't see Gavin in video.
I'm just sorting out this alarm doesn't go off. Give me a second.
Damon. So this, I had a thought for a sec. Just, oh yeah, but then he goes. Then he still goes. Yes, the city of refuge.
Yes, no, not the
unintentional killing.
Yeah, a human being that does it. The owner of this.
Not his ox. If his ox kills, it's.
He just doesn't pay. He just doesn't pay the kofar. That's it.
Yeah.
The Gemara is going to come and bring. Does he pay damages then? If he's not liable for kofar, that's a different discussion. But the principle is twofold. Kofar is for an atonement. And compensation for the family, and atonement for the owner of the ox that is habitually goring. But the ox is not stoned because the ox killed unintentionally, and therefore we don't put the ox to death. In a case where the animal is not put to death, there's no kofar payment. There's a juxtaposition between kofar payment and the stoning of the animal. Just like there was a juxtaposition between one's ox who killed a slave unintentionally, and therefore the ox is not stoned, and the 30 shekel payment for the owner of the slave. The two are juxtapositioned. Okay? And I'm going to give you a source for this. Rabba's source, for it stated in regard to a muad that kills a person, the ox shall be stoned, and even its owner shall die, when kofar shall be assessed against him. This implies that whenever the ox is punished with stoning for killing a person, the owner pays kofar. But if the ox is not punished with stoning, for example, if it killed unintentionally and is not liable for death, the owner does not pay kofar. Okay? And that's in Exodus Shmot chapter 21, verse 29 to 30. Okay? The Gemara questions Rabba's ruling. A buyer challenged him from a Mishnah. One who says my ox killed so-and-so, or one who says my ox killed so-and-so's ox. This person pays on the basis of his own admission. Okay? So basically, this is the source of it is in a Mishnah in Ketubot 41a. And even the Gemara in 15b in Bava Kamma explains that this Mishnah, according to Rashi, is discussing a muad, not a tam. So this Mishnah in Ketubot 41a illustrates the difference between payments that are based on the amount of damage inflicted, which can be imposed on the basis of one's own admission, and those that bear no relation to the amount of damage, like the 30 shekel payment, imposed when one's muad kills a slave. Because the latter payment is considered a knas, and the payment with regards to actual kofir is slightly different, because that is more of a monetary obligation based on the amount of actual damage. Okay, so let me put it like this. So a buyer presents his challenge as follows. Is it not that with regard to the mission of his ox killed so-and-so, that the missioner refers to a payment of kofir? Now an ox cannot be executed on the basis of its owner's admission, yet the missioner rules that its owner is nevertheless obligated to pay kofir. So what we are saying is twofold. Is firstly, you've got to see the difference. Firstly, a buyer is trying to say there's not the same thing between the 30 shekel payment and the kofir payment. Why? Because 30 shekel payment resembles a penalty. How does it resemble a penalty? Is because if the slave is worth a dinar or a seller or 30 shekels, you have to pay this fixed amount. We've learned that in the case of a seducer or various other crimes, a rapist, etc., or somebody that is a defamer, that you pay a set amount. Does that make sense, guys? There's a set amount. So too with this 30 shekel fine, how can it be compensation? Because you're not compensating the owner for what the slave is worth. So how can that be deemed a compensation? It has to be deemed a kanas, a penalty, because of the fixed nature of it. And since the 30 shekel fine is considered a penalty, the owner doesn't pay by his own admission. Does that make sense? Whereas kofir, we're talking about a muad ox here, a muad. We're not talking about the fact that when we look at half payment damages, that is considered a penalty, because some of the rabbis say it's a mammon, it's considered compensation, but he doesn't have to pay in full. And some of the rabbis say it's a kanas because it's a tame ox and you shouldn't really have to pay anything. So in that particular case, it's a divergent opinion. But because with muad, it's full payment, what are you paying back? When your ox was killed by another person's ox, you're getting your money back from choice property on the full value of your ox. Now that's compensation. You have a loss, you were paid back for that loss. With kofir payment, it's assessed on the value of the victim halachically. So therefore, that victim was worth X amount. That victim's family is paid back X amount. You'll never bring back the value of the person, the human being. But financial compensation was made. So that's not a knas. It's not a penalty. So you can't equate the payment for the 30 shekel payment the same for the payment for the kofir. They're two different. The one is mammon, compensation, based on the victim, and the other one is not based on the value of the slave. It's based on a set amount. So therefore, it's a penalty. Okay? So what it's saying is, look, a buyer is saying there's a distinguishing difference, because he's saying that the Mishnah in Ketubot 41a is saying that one who says my ox killed so-and-so person, or one who says my ox killed so-and-so ox, this person pays on the basis of his own admission. Now, is this then we're talking about kofir. We can't be talking about the 30 shekel payment. This is the question. A buyer is saying they can't be the same. So how does a buyer bring this up? Because Rabbi is saying, listen, there's a parallel here. Gavin, is it my voice coming back on the phone? Do you want to mute yourself and Kevin?
Yeah, I'll mute you.
Okay. So what we are saying is as follows. Rabbi is saying, listen, there's a parallel. Kevin, the parallel is just like if your ox isn't stoned to death for the unintentional killing, it doesn't matter if it's a slave or a free person. If the ox isn't stoned to death, for a slave, you don't have to pay the 30 shekel payment to the owner of the slave. And if your ox is not sentenced to death because it unintentionally kills a free Jew, somebody that's not enslaved, in that particular case, you don't have to pay the kofir payment. Why? Because it's an unintentional killing. Therefore, the ox is not stoned. So Rabbi is saying whenever the ox isn't stoned, you don't pay kofar, you don't pay the 30 shekel payment. You don't pay either, because it's always a juxtaposition. Only when the ox is stoned, because it would be stoned in the case of an intentional killing, is your ox stoned. Whenever the ox is stoned, then you have to pay the 30 shekel payment, or you have to pay for kofar. 30 shekel for the slave, 30 or kofar for a free Jew. So in other words, he's trying to make a parallel that in the case of unintentional killing, when the ox is not stoned, there's no payments due. Abaye is saying there's a problem with this, because there's a Gemara in 41a in Ketubot that is saying something different. Is that it's considered that he does pay, even if he's paying by his own admission. So what does this own admission have to do with anything? You can't sentence an ox to death if the owner admits to this. Why can't you send Kevin, the owner, to death? Arthur, Kevin, I'm not asking Kevin, he's done review. I can't hear you, you're on mute.
Yeah, can't you send the owner to death if the ox kills?
No, we're not sending any owner to death. I'm saying we're not sentencing the ox to death if the owner admits that his ox killed another Jew. We don't send the animal to death for stoning, and therefore in that particular case, we are saying that you still pay the kofar.
He has to pay some form of punishment. He has to still pay
some
form of punishment.
Okay, but again, what I'm saying is, what Abaye is saying is he's arguing with Rabba. Okay, Rabba is turning around and saying that he's basically saying, look, the degree of evidence needed to execute an animal is the same as what's required to execute a person guilty of a capital crime, right? So if a person can't be executed on the basis of his own admission, that's why we don't execute the ox by stoning in the Mishnah's case, because the owner admitted that his ox killed a person. So by his own admission, it's the same as a person admitting to the court that he killed somebody. We don't give the death penalty on that basis. So we don't give the ox the death penalty based on the fact that the owner, who's a Jew, admitted that his ox killed somebody. So therefore the ox isn't stoned to death. But we see in that case in Ketubot 41a that the kofar payment is still paid, because even though by his own admission he said it is, because we say, listen, there's a distinct difference. I can understand in the case of the 30 shekel payment, because there you can say it's a kanas according to some of the rabbis. It's a fine. So by your own admission you're not paying the 30 shekels. So as long as you come before the witnesses do, then there's no problem, because you don't pay by your own admission. So we understand why the 30 shekels is not paid by your own admission. Okay, that's fine. But in the case of kofar, you don't pay by your own, you still pay the kofar, even though it's by your own admission, because even though the animal isn't sentenced to death. Why is the animal not sentenced to death? Is because a Jew would not be sentenced to death for a capital crime that he admitted to. So to the Jewish owner of the ox that admitted to his ox killing somebody is not sentenced to death. It's all paralleled. But considering kofar, that is not a knas. That's not a fine. What it actually is, it's a mammon. It's compensation to the heirs of the victim. So we can see kofar is paid. So Abai is saying, I don't agree with Rabba's paralleling of the case. Hi, Adina. Does that make sense, guys? In other words, Rashi is explaining that the reason that the animal isn't executed on the basis of its owner's admission is that the execution is considered a fine with regards to the 30 shekels, and that's why it doesn't pay. But for the non-execution of the ox, it's different. The animal doesn't get the death penalty because you can't get the death penalty if you admit to capital case, nor can the owner, the Jewish owner of an ox, obligate his ox to be stoned on the admission if he admits it, but he still has to pay kofir. So Abai is proving to Rabbah, it seems, that there's no correlation, because again, Rabbah is saying, if there's no stoning, there's no kofir payment, there's no 30 shekel payment. So Abai is turning around and saying, I understand there's no 30 shekel payment, because it's seen as a knas. If the owner of the animal is admitting to it, you don't have to pay, because if you admit to your own crime, you don't have to pay if it's a penalty. But in terms of kofir, you would have to pay. This is his proof. He's not agreeing with Rabbah that the reason you don't have to pay is because the animal isn't stoned. He's saying the animal isn't stoned here, but you still have to pay kofir. Guys, can everybody see the argument? I want Kevin to be able to call it back to me before we move on. Gav, do you understand it? I can't hear you, on mute.
Yeah.
Gav, you understand?
Still on mute, Gavin. Damon, I went over it, but I didn't have much time. I have been over it very briefly. That's why.
That's okay.
I'm going to have to go over it again.
I just wanted to make an observation. This is my observation: is that the kofir payment is normally a compensation and an atonement.
Correct.
In this particular case,
exactly.
But yeah, I'm not arguing with you. But now in this particular case, it's not an atonement because it's his own admission, and then there's no need. It's just compensation in this particular case.
Correct, Evan. Correct.
That's my observation.
So that's dead on the mark. So Abai is saying yes. It's true that there's no atonement part of it, because no atonement is necessary because the animal isn't put to death. Although, Gavin, it could be argued that he doesn't say that on one basis, is that the ox was muad, hey? And even because they can't stone it, and therefore because the person, just like a person should die if they killed somebody, but by their own admission they don't get the death penalty. It doesn't mean that doesn't mean that at the hands of heaven they won't be held accountable. Just like the owner of a dangerous ox, you technically can't put the owner you can't make him pay kofir because he admitted that his ox did it. Doesn't mean he's not responsible in Shemaim. He hasn't done himself any favors.
But you definitely, I would think, okay, it's a good point you're making. I would think that you definitely better off having come in and on your own admission, even with Hashem, you're definitely better off.
Listen, I agree that you're better off, and
you're not wasting the court's time. You're acknowledging it. You're paying whatever is due, that type of thing.
Yeah, but the point of it is saying that there's no due. In other words, there's two different arguments in the Gemara. The one is saying, look, there's either a payment for kofir or damages.
Yeah.
Okay, so according to a buyer, you pay in the kofir because it's compensation to the family in lieu of damages. Okay, but it's not called a kofir. So hopefully that does provide an atonement because you're paying. Hopefully, according to a buyer, it does. Because if you don't pay it, according to Rabbah, then in fact it's a problem, because it's just like a person that technically gets off the hook on earth court. In heaven, they hold you liable. So just because, like Rabbi Yosef Mizrahi points out, he says people like Zuma and people that don't get to pay in this world, they think they're getting clever. They wish they paid in this world. So too, one doesn't get the death penalty because he clears his conscience by saying, listen, he killed a Jew, Reuven admits he killed Shimon, but they can't put him to death. He shouldn't say, well, great, I got off the death penalty. In that case, he should be tragically mourning that he never gave his life up for the fact that he doesn't get atonement necessarily. He might get some sort of atonement for if he was genuinely contrite. But if he killed him on purpose, say Reuven killed Shimon, Kevin, on purpose, but there were no witnesses, he doesn't get the death penalty, and maybe Hashem will look at it in the next world and say, listen, he did do a kapora, and maybe he might get some atonement. But what happens is a person like that gets born in another incarnation in many cases, and he himself is murdered, so that can atone for his soul fully. Because it says in Pikei Avot, the one rabbi was talking to another, said, you see that head that's floating in the river? He drowned people, so therefore he was drowned, and those that drowned him will be drowned in turn, whether it be in this lifetime or another. So Gavin's got a good point. But all I'm saying is it's not necessarily a full atonement, but it does. The bottom line is Abaye is saying to Rabbi, how do you explain this? Because kofar is still paid. You want to say that kofar isn't paid because the animal isn't executed. And I'm saying here that this is a proof that the kofar is still paid, even though that animal isn't stoned on a technicality, because the owner admitted that what his ox did. So he's not stoned. So how do you explain this, Rabbi? So Rabbi explains it as follows. He's saying, look, in this particular case, we wouldn't call it kofar. We would call it damages. So although the Torah exempts the owner for kofar, he's nonetheless liable for damages to his victim. So let me just tell you how technically complicated it gets. Is that even if the owner of the ox is not required to pay kofar as an atonement because he was negligent, and his negligence led to the death of the victim, the Torah made his guilt contingent on the execution of the ox. Nevertheless, he's no less liable for the damage caused by his ox than if it merely wounded his victim. So just as in the case where you're liable for the decrease in value of a victim wounded by his ox as determined by the victim's worth in the slave market, etc. So here he's liable to damages for the death of his ox, this victim. In other words, the loss of the entire value of the victim. So say, for example, on damages, you rendered the person half useless. You pay half. Here they're completely non-functional, so you pay the full value on the victim. Okay? Now, so that form of monetary compensation for the death of the victim, some rabbis would probably say it's an atonement because you're really being clapped. And others would say, listen, it's compensation to the family. Either way, the family must be compensated. Okay? And we're saying, look, that works out well according to the halacha. Because the halacha is stating that how do you pay kofar? On the value, Kevin, of the victim. Then you're okay, because the monetary payments parallel. They parallel each other. Kofar, you pay in the value of the victim. Okay? And then damages you pay in the value of the victim. There it's cool. But it doesn't quite work out if you say it's paid on the value of the owner of the ox, because he should have lost his life. And therefore he's redeeming his own life, so it's paid on the value of the owner of the ox. It doesn't quite equate in that case. Because you could be paying more. Maybe the owner of the ox is worth more than the victim. Or maybe you're paying less, is that the victim is worth more than the owner of the ox. Okay? So that's the halachic implication in that particular case. For one thing, I mean, there is another halachic implication. If it's considered a kofar, you got to come hell or high water. You got to pay that money because your life in Shemaim is hanging in the balance. If it's considered your life isn't apparently hanging in the balance, you have to compensate the family for the loss of their loved one, but it's a monetary obligation. It's not having your life at the hands of heaven also put forward. Because what if the owner of the ox only owned that ox, right? And he doesn't have the value to pay back the victim. Maybe the victim was worth a small fortune on the slave market, and his ox was a tiny ox and managed to get the victim in the heart. Then maybe that ox wasn't stoned, but he definitely does. Even if he pays for damages from choice property or whatever, maybe he doesn't have the money. Maybe all he can give is that ox that's technically not sentenced to death in this particular case. So maybe the victim's heirs should get 200 zuz, but that ox that attacked was a good aimer, aimed for the heart, but is only worth 60 zuz. Just happened to be a very talented ox. In that particular case, he still owes what do you call it, 120s was shah. So if he's impoverished and it's seen as a monetary payment to the heirs, halachically, for damages, he's off the hook if he doesn't have the money. You can't get blood out of a stone. That's all you can get. But according to Shemaim, he better borrow the money to pay it back. Otherwise, they'll hold him responsible in Shemaim. So that's the technical difference if it's seen as damages or kofir. Okay. All right, guys. I think we've done enough. Yeah.
But Damon, at the end of the day, someone can't just get off scot-free, regardless if animal was tam or the damage was unintentional. There must be some form, either kofir or tam or more damages. That's they can't just get off scot-free.
So we're talking only muat here. The tam is off the hook.
Okay, yeah. I mean, they can't. They have to pay either kofir or damages.
Correct. Even if you want to say according to Rabbi could have quoted Rabbi Eliezer, who said, "Listen, I still see that there is half payment, there's half kofir damages in a case where the ox isn't executed because you pay in the body of the ox. In other words, where the owner of the ox admitted or the ox killed unintentionally." We don't stone the ox, so you owe half kofir. I would think that's only because of that term, the owner of the ox is absolved, that you need that verse to tell you that you're off the hook for half kofir. Okay? Technically. So in terms of muad, Rav Eliezer says technically, when the ox isn't stoned, you still have to pay. In other words, Rav Eliezer doesn't see a correlation between stoning the ox and the kofir. For a muad ox. There's no correlation. Rabbi could have just answered that he agrees with Rav Eliezer, but out of respect for Rav Eliezer, he didn't do that because he didn't want to say to say to Abaya, "Yo, you disagree with Rav Eliezer." Out of respect for Rav Eliezer, he didn't want to say that. He said, "Listen, there's a different reason. I could put to damages." You know, you call it kofir, I call it damages, potato, tomato, whatever. I mean, if you're paying on the value of the victim, the money's the same. So what he's saying is that's my response to you. But for muat, for sure. But Rabbi's saying, no, it's not called kofir, it's called damages. You still have to pay. Kevin's right. So even Abaya is saying, listen, we don't call it kofir technically. We call it damages, and Rabbi Eliezer would call it kofir, that you do have to pay. It has no incumbence upon the stoning. These calls it proper kofir, Rabbi Eliezer. All right, guys, I hope I made it clear. So
okay.